November 2017, the Peninsula, Beverly Hills, 11:47 p.m. When Ozzy Osbourne settled into the armchair in the corner of the lobby, he had no idea that the woman across from him would call him a monster poisoning America's youth within the next 10 minutes. What she didn't know was this: the lesson she'd received from the Prince of Darkness that night would be something no textbook in her 15-year career could ever teach. But what would truly change everything for both of them was the third person about to walk into that lobby. Dr. Caldwell wasn't staying at the hotel that night. She was just waiting for someone. Her son Daniel had moved to Los Angeles after being expelled from Stanford, and for the past 3 months he hadn't answered any of his mother's calls. That night, she was waiting for a meeting arranged through one of Daniel's old friends. They were supposed to meet at 11:30, but Daniel still hadn't shown up. Margaret glanced at her watch. 17 minutes late. She sat at the bar in the corner of the lobby and ordered a glass of white wine. Her hand trembled slightly, but no one noticed, because Dr. Margaret Caldwell never appeared weak. That's when a figure entering through the hotel's main door caught her attention. Long brown hair, round, dark glasses, a simple black t-shirt and faded jeans. His walk was a bit slow, a bit tired. Margaret looked for a moment, then her eyes widened. This man was Ozzy Osbourne, the Prince of Darkness, one of rock and roll's most controversial figures, one of the men Margaret had criticized for years, someone she'd labeled as a bad example for youth in her books. In the 3rd chapter of her latest book, she had devoted 12 full pages to the damage rock stars inflicted on society, describing Ozzy as a figure who normalizes addiction and glorifies violence. Ozzy sat down in an armchair across the lobby. He pulled out his phone, typed a message, then slipped it back into his pocket. When the waiter approached, he only asked for a glass of water. Margaret watched him. Years of accumulated thoughts churned in her mind. The man who bit off a bat's head. The man who went on stage drunk. The man who lived out his entire relationship with his children on television. Every sentence she'd written in her book. Every statistic. Every argument suddenly came alive. A voice inside her said, "Let it go." But another voice, a much stronger one, whispered, "Don't miss this opportunity." Margaret set her glass down on the table and stood up. Her heels echoed on the marble as she walked toward Ozzy. When he looked up, Margaret was already standing in front of him. There was a professional but cold smile on her face. Ozzy raised his eyebrows slightly, studying this unfamiliar woman with curiosity. Margaret extended her hand. "Dr. Margaret Caldwell," she said, her voice echoing clearly in the hotel's silence. "Clinical psychologist and author. I know who you are, Mr. Osbourne." Ozzy shook her hand with a slight smile. "Pleased to meet you, ma'am," he said, his Birmingham accent seeping through his words. Margaret didn't step back. In fact, she took another step closer. "Actually, there's something I'd like to discuss with you," Margaret said, her voice now harder. "For years, I've been researching the damage that figures like you inflict on society. People who glamorize addiction, normalize violence, send the wrong messages to young people." She paused, waiting for Ozzy's reaction. But Ozzy's face held only a calm expression. Margaret continued. "You became a role model for an entire generation, Mr. Osbourne, and that generation is now sitting in my clinic. Cocaine addicts, alcoholics, young people lost in the darkness. They're all singing your songs, hanging your posters on their walls." Her voice rose, and several people in the lobby turned their heads. "What did you teach them? That doing drugs is cool? That humiliating your family on television is normal?" Ozzy was silent for a moment. Then he took a sip of water from his glass, calm as if Margaret had never spoken. This composure made Margaret even angrier. "Aren't you going to respond?" she said, her voice now clearly irritated. "Or are you drunk right now, too?" That last sentence hung in the air. The silence in the lobby sharpened. A few hotel employees glanced at each other uncomfortably. Ozzy removed his glasses and looked directly into Margaret's eyes. In those pale blue eyes, there was none of the anger Margaret had expected. No defensiveness, only a deep, weary understanding. And perhaps pain. "Ma'am," Ozzy said, his voice low but clear, You seem to know a lot about me. From newspaper headlines, gossip, maybe a few documentaries. He paused. But let me ask you something. Have you ever really, truly, talked to an addict? Not in your clinic, not on your television program, on the street, in the middle of the night, when that person has hit rock bottom? Margaret didn't answer. Ozzy continued. I lived in that hell for 40 years. I danced with death every single day. And yes, I did terrible things. To my family, to myself, to others. I'm not denying any of that. He paused for a moment, his eyes drifting into the distance. But I also know this. Addiction isn't a choice, it's a disease, and judging sick people doesn't heal them. It only pushes them deeper. Margaret opened her mouth to say something, but Ozzy continued. I've read your books, Mom. Yes, I have. Sharon showed them to me. You write beautifully. You present impressive statistics. But you're missing something. Ozzy leaned forward. Addicts aren't your enemy. They're victims. And sometimes a hand, a word, a song from the most unexpected place can save their lives. Something broke on Margaret's face. Only for a moment, but Ozzy saw it. This man who had spent years reading people noticed something in the woman's eyes. Fear and guilt. Are you, Ozzy said slowly, waiting for someone tonight? Margaret's face went white. Her lips trembled. That's none of your business, she said, but her voice cracked. Ozzy stood up. Now they were looking directly into each other's eyes. Mom, Ozzy said, his voice now soft, almost tender. For years I saw that same look in Sharon's eyes. When a mother or father is worried about their child, that look is the same everywhere. Margaret stepped back as if Ozzy had physically pushed her. Her eyes filled with tears, but she refused to cry. You, she started, but her sentence was cut short. Because at that very moment, a figure entering through the hotel's main door changed everything. A 23-year-old young man stumbled into the lobby. His eyes were red, his hands were shaking. His clothes looked like they hadn't been changed in days. Margaret's face instantly lost all its color. Daniel, she whispered. Daniel took a few steps, then stopped. When he saw his mother, something crossed his face. Shame, anger, fear, all at once. Margaret wanted to run to her son, but her feet were glued to the floor. The woman who had spent years explaining how to deal with addiction on television, in her books, at conferences, was now completely helpless in front of her own son. Daniel didn't even look at his mother. His eyes were searching for the exit on the other side of the lobby, as if he wanted to escape like he'd never come here at all. Daniel, Margaret said again, her voice broken. Please, let's just talk. Daniel finally turned to his mother. The redness in his eyes, the hollows beneath his cheekbones, the hands that tried to stop shaking but couldn't. Everything was a living catalogue of the symptoms Margaret had listed as warning signs for years. Talk! Daniel's voice was hoarse and bitter. You've been talking for years, Mom. You talk on television, you talk in your books, you talk at conferences. But with me? You never talked with me. You just diagnosed me. Margaret took a step forward, but Daniel stepped back. Do you know what you said when I got expelled from Stanford? This was your choice, Daniel. You have to live with the consequences. As if I chose this. As if every night when I was swallowing those pills, I was thinking, great, let me ruin my life. His voice rose. A few people in the lobby turned their heads, but no one intervened. You're an addiction specialist, Mom, but how long did it take you to notice your own son was an addict? 2 years? 3 years? Tears began streaming down Margaret's face. The wall she had built for years, that flawless professional mask, was crumbling piece by piece. I was trying to protect you, she said, her voice reduced to a whisper. I was trying to fix you. Daniel let out a bitter laugh. Fix me? Mom, I'm not a broken clock. I'm your son, and you never once listened to me. You just analyzed me. Margaret was crying now, silently, her shoulders shaking. In the middle of the lobby, in her Chanel jacket and pearl necklace, America's most famous psychologist had completely fallen apart. That's when a voice everyone had forgotten spoke up. Young man. Ozzy had risen to his feet. He approached Daniel with slow steps. Margaret looked up, her eyes wide with surprise. Daniel turned too and studied the man in front of him. For a moment he didn't recognize him, then his eyes grew wide. You're Ozzy Osbourne," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of shock and respect. Ozzy nodded. "Yeah, that's me," he said simply. "And you're Daniel. The last person your mother hoped to see in this state, but the one she's missed so deeply." Something softened on Daniel's face, just for a moment. Then it hardened again. "This is none of your business," he said, but his voice came out less sharp. Ozzy shrugged. "Maybe it isn't," he said, "but I was once in your place too. In an even worse place, actually." Ozzy sat down in one of the armchairs in the middle of the lobby and gestured to Daniel. 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes. After that, you can leave if you want. No one will stop you." Daniel hesitated for a moment. He looked at his mother, then at Ozzy. Finally, as if his legs were too tired to carry him anymore, he collapsed into the armchair across from Ozzy. Margaret took a step forward, but Ozzy gently raised his hand. "Mom," he said in a soft voice, "maybe this time it's time to just listen." Margaret stopped. Her lips trembled, but she said nothing. Slowly she stepped back and sat in a nearby chair. For the first time in her life, she would just watch instead of trying to control. Ozzy turned to Daniel. "How old are you, son?" Daniel cleared his throat. 23. Ozzy nodded. 23. When I was 23, we'd just released Black Sabbath's first album. The world was at my feet. And me? I was losing myself a little more every night. Alcohol, drugs, whatever I could find. Daniel raised his eyebrows. But you're a legend." Ozzy laughed, but there was no joy in it. "A legend? Son, I lived in hell for 40 years. I bit the head off a bat. I nearly hurt my wife. I missed my children growing up. This legend you're talking about is really just a wreck who managed to survive." He paused, his eyes drifting into the distance. "But you know what the worst part was? The worst part was the loneliness. I had millions of fans, but at night I was alone in my room, because no one really understood. Everyone knew Ozzy, the stage Ozzy, the crazy rock star, but the scared kid inside, no one saw him." Daniel's eyes filled with tears. His lips trembled. "I also," he started, but his voice broke. "I feel the same way. At Stanford, everyone knew me as Dr. Caldwell's son. I had to be perfect. I had to be successful. I had to be the model of a healthy individual from my mother's books." A tear rolled down his cheek. "And I couldn't do it. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't do it." Ozzy leaned forward. "Son, I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to listen carefully. I've been to hundreds of rehab centers in my life. I've seen hundreds of doctors. Hundreds of experts told me what I needed to do." He paused. "But they weren't what saved me. The only thing that saved me was when someone finally told me, 'You are enough. Just as you are, with your broken pieces, your mistakes, with all of it, you are enough.'" Daniel was openly crying now. "But I've ruined so much. School, my family, everything." Ozzy shook his head. "No, son. You haven't ruined anything yet. You've just lost your way. And losing your way isn't the end of the journey." He pulled an old, worn coin from his pocket. On it was written, 1 year clean. "This is my first sobriety chip," Ozzy said. "From the 1980s. 2 weeks after I got it, I drank again. Then I quit again. Then I started again. This cycle went on for years." He held out the chip to Daniel. "But every time, after every fall, I learned something. Falling isn't something to be ashamed of. Staying down where you fell, that's the real tragedy." Daniel looked at the chip, then at Ozzy. "Why are you giving this to me?" Ozzy smiled, that familiar, crooked smile. "Because you're stronger than me, son. When I was 23, no one helped me. No one sat down and talked with me. You have people around you who love you. You just need to let your walls down." He turned to Margaret. "And sometimes the people who love you most can hurt you the most, because they're scared too. They feel helpless too, but that doesn't mean they don't love you." Daniel looked at his mother. Margaret was still crying. Silently, her hands clasped together in her lap. The woman who had controlled everything for years was now completely defenseless. And maybe Maybe this was exactly how it was supposed to be. Daniel stood up. He took a few steps, then stopped in front of his mother. "Mom," he said, his voice still broken but no longer angry. I was so mad at you. Maybe I still am, but—" He paused. Margaret lifted her head and looked into her son's eyes. "But I love you," Daniel said. "And I know I need help. Real help. Not just a diagnosis, not just statistics. Real help." Margaret sprang to her feet and embraced her son. Tightly, desperately, as if she would never let him go again. Daniel stood rigid at first, then slowly wrapped his arms around his mother. In the middle of the lobby, as midnight approached, mother and son held on to each other. Ozzy quietly rose to his feet. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a business card, and placed it on the side table next to Margaret. "This is my personal number," he said in a low voice, "and the number of a rehab center. In Malibu. The people who work there truly understand. They listen instead of diagnosing." Margaret lifted her head, her eyes still wet. I said such terrible things to you," she said, her voice filled with shame. "I judged you, I insulted you, and—" Ozzy raised his hand. "Mom, I've heard much worse things in my life, and I deserved most of them." He smiled. "But tonight, maybe we both learned something. I learned that even experts can sometimes lose their way. And you?" He paused. "Maybe you learned that sometimes the best treatment is simply being there." 6 months later, Dr. Margaret Caldwell was in New York for the launch of her new book. But this book was different from the others. The cover read, "The Power of Listening, Confessions of a Mother and an Expert." The book's foreword began like this: "For me to write this book, it took a rock legend teaching me the hardest lesson. That night, in the lobby of the Peninsula, Ozzy Osbourne helped me see my own son, and he taught me this. Addiction is not a statistic, not a diagnosis, not a failure. Addiction is the cry for help from a person in pain. And sometimes the best help is to shut up and listen." Daniel went to the center in Malibu that night. He received treatment for 6 months. It wasn't easy. It was never easy. There were relapses, difficult nights, moments when he nearly gave up. But every time he looked at that old chip in his pocket. The 1-year clean inscription had faded, but the meaning was still there. And his mother was different this time. Instead of offering solutions, she sat beside him. Instead of controlling, she simply loved. In an interview, Margaret said, "For years I told people how to deal with addiction. But I learned the truth that night. You don't deal with addiction. You live with it. Every day, every hour, every minute, you make the choice again. And to be able to make that choice, a person needs one thing: to know they are loved without judgment."